area to demonstrate the connection between that area and the whole royal dynasty of Majapahit, particularly through the enshrining of ancestors or the apotheosis of ancestors, making them into gods. So religion was important for connecting the bits of Majapahit towards the centre of the empire. And Majapahit itself, the king was first amongst equals, but the extended royal family had within it a set of very powerful local interests, and the king was always having to balance through marriage and occasionally through warfare relationships between those elements. So the royal tourneys where the king goes out, and he's described as travelling right over to East Java and then back over in more or less towards Central Java. These are all ritual excursions, but they're also excursions that are political in the same vein. So I think that tells us a little bit about why Majapahit looks differently than we might expect. It's a very flexible kind of political entity. And this is, actually this is located around here near Blitar, so quite a way away from the main palace of Majapahit at Mojokerto. Up there, something there, you actually have the main state temple of Majapahit, Candi Panataran. So the king had to go a long way to celebrate his major state rituals. And Candi Panataran is very spread out, and we've actually tried to reassemble, particularly in Lydia Keevan's work, a picture of how it functioned based on what we know about Balinese temples, which have separate courtyards, are also oriented towards the mountains, and seem to have functions very similar in terms of the holding of rituals to do with holy water. So using retrospective accounts, we try to put together this picture of what these temples were like. But again, there's not a lot left. There's gateways, there's a number of separate structures, mainly platforms with these reliefs telling of different narratives, but you have to imagine that there would have been larger wooden buildings on top of these platforms. These are some of the reliefs, the Ramayana. In a particularly East Javanese style, it is flattened, that tells us that the Wayang, the shadow theatre, is already an important part of how the Hindu myths are realised in ancient Java at the time. And we can see, particularly in the Panataran reliefs, more or less direct relation between the evolution of the Wayang and what was going on in East Java at the time. Likewise, there's other temples, Candi Surawono. It's a modest but quite beautiful set of reliefs on that temple. That also has the temptation of Arjuna in its narratives. And here's Mount Penanggungan, which is the nearest mountain to the capital of Majapahit. It was an extinct volcano. Intriguingly, it's a set of volcanic plugs. And what we think was that this is a natural manifestation of a mandala, an object of meditation. And if you like, and this is how the ancient Javanese myths describe it, the Himalayan mountains plonked down in East Java, that the gods brought bits of Himalaya and realised them in East Java. And this particular shape of Mount Penanggungan tells us that. Mount Penanggungan was the site where a lot of members of the Majapahit royal family had their shrines, but again, these were very small shrines in comparison. And I think there's, originally that was put at 80, but I think the number is now well over 100 separate small, large and small shrines spread right over the top of this mountain. So if you've got a day or two to go hiking all over the area, you can see these shrines dotted all over the place. Again, a different picture of how religion worked. We also have, from the late Majapahit, the fantastic temple of Candi Suku, which is actually close to Solo in central Java, which has strange exorcistic themes taken mainly from the Mahabharata, but with other things. There's images of Garuda and Bhima, but with all of these kind of weird sexual images. See that pyramid there would have actually had a giant phallus on top of it, but so as not to offend people's sensitivities, the phallus is actually hidden away in a back room in the Central Museum in Jakarta, and people have speculated about what kinds of weird exorcistic and fertility rituals went on in this site, but it's a long way from the classical picture of Hindu Buddhism that you get in the Indian traditions, and very much a Southeast Asian version with images of stories that we can't quite explain, including this one of Ganesha, which doesn't correspond to anything that we know in Hindu mythology. Now, I just want to briefly talk a little bit about the legacy of Majapahit. I've gone on a little longer than I had planned. And we have to think about a lot of aspects of Southeast Asian culture that are otherwise overlooked as having their origins and certainly spreading through the period of Majapahit. This is one of my favourites and one that I've done research on. The story of Panji. Is anybody familiar with the story of Panji? No, not really. Okay. So whereas Hinduism gave us ancient Hindu myths, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, the Panji story is the indigenous Southeast Asian myth. It's one of the only stories that we know through these reliefs which is of Southeast Asian origin. It tells of princes and princesses, usually the stories of the kingdoms of Jangala and Kadiri, which were the predecessor kingdoms of Majapahit, but also subparts of Majapahit itself. How a prince of Jangala loses his betrothed. She gets blown away by the wind and he has to go on a big quest looking for her, has lots of adventures, wages war with other kingdoms, acquires a bunch of other wives on the way. This is definitely not monogamous. Usually Panji ends up with something like 100 wives or something, but his lost betrothed is the main wife. And these seem to be reflections of the nature of royalty and the royal polities that existed, but also this idea of the dispersed kingdoms, that you had to wander through the countryside of Java and to other parts of other neighbouring islands in order to build up power, to acquire wives and to build political relations with other kinds of kingdoms. So these are stories, the story of Panji and his lost betrothed Chandra Kirana, are stories of mobility and how politics worked in ancient Java. These stories probably started in the 13th century, although we're not quite sure, because we have some reliefs from Candi Jawi that seem to be Panji stories. We don't know whether the reliefs were put on when the temple was first built or whether they were added later. But certainly they're spread throughout Majapahit temples, and they're a very distinctive East Javanese narrative that was important for the Majapahit royal family. And we have a number of these other sites. There's a 15th century image of the main hero, Panji. Here, whoops, that's there. And a statue which was removed from Mount Penanggungan and is now in the Institute of Technology in Bandung, that also represents the spread of this story. We also have a number of reliefs from all over East Java that seem to depict the Panji story, although as yet we haven't worked out precisely what they mean. Now, the Panji stories were important in Java, so you still find them performed in topeng masked dances in East Java. There's a form of wayang that told about them, the wayang gedog, which is semi-extinct. And the importance was shown by the fact that these forms were everywhere in Java, certainly in the 19th century. These are two examples collected by Sir Stamford Raffles, who had a set of wayang gedog puppets, and Raffles also had this set of topeng masks. So these are both from the British Museum in London, and Raffles was quite interested in his history of Java, talks about the significance of these stories and how they illuminate the Javanese past. There's also some of the most ancient paintings we have from Java, the Wayang BEBER, which are 17th and 18th century paintings from two sites in just east of central Java. These are also Panji story paintings on bark cloth. But we do know that Panji stories spread elsewhere. So I've analysed the famous ship cloths of Lampung in South Sumatra, and they also are Panji stories. We can see here that figure there is Panji as shown in the Wayang gedog. So we know that these stories travelled outside of outside of Java to Sumatra, but they then actually became the mainstay of Malay literature. So a lot of the classic works of Malay literature, the Hikayat Cekel Waning Pati, there's a number of longer epics, also shorter works in Malay literature, the Hikayat Andakan Penurat, for example. These are all Panji stories, and at one stage this was the heart of a much larger Southeast Asian culture that has largely been forgotten. Where they're best remembered is actually in Thailand, where the Thai versions of the Panji stories, known as Inao, are actually, they were rewritten by the ancestors of the current ruling dynasty in Thailand. And so everybody in Thailand, although when you go to Java and you ask people about Panji stories, they'll kind of look at you and maybe some people will know about them. But in Thailand, everybody knows about the story of Inao, which is the name of Panji in Thailand. And there are actually very direct correspondence between the content of the Thai versions of the Panji story and what you find in the Javanese versions and other versions throughout Southeast Asia. And this came to Thailand via the Malay tradition. This is actually one of the main royal wats, a small royal wat in Bangkok, Wat Samanat Wihan in the early 19th century, illustrated with Panji stories. And in this particular version, Panji travels around different parts of the world, including to Malacca. So the depiction on the left is of the exotic kingdom of Malacca. And there's also this, I love this, an image of what was exotic to the Thais in the 19th century, kangaroos or wallabies. I'm not sure how they got there, but I love it. And through Thailand, then there are also Burmese and Cambodian versions of this Inao Panji story. So this is a core part of Southeast Asian tradition that comes from Majapahit. All right, I'm running out of time, so I'll just pass over some other elements. But particularly, I think what I want to stress is the ways that so much of Majapahit has survived in Bali. And Bali is, although again it's been adapted, it's changed, Bali is one of our major points of insight into the kingdom of Majapahit. The story of Panji, which I've done research on in Bali, was once well known. Again, it's passed out of mainstream knowledge, but there were lots of remnants in literature, in art, in performance, particularly in the classic Balinese gumbuk, a dance drama, which performed these Panji stories and was at the heart of the kingdoms of Bali that existed up until Dutch conquest and actually into Dutch conquest. And you can still see this ancient Javanese or adaptation of an ancient Javanese dance drama in present-day Bali. And likewise, a lot of aspects of Balinese theatre, including the legong and other things, come via Gumbu and via this Majapahit tradition into making up the Balinese cultural tradition, which Balinese have elaborated on in different ways. So when you visit temples and palaces, what's left of palaces in Java and in Bali and in Lombok as well, which was heavily influenced by Bali, you'll see lots of remnants of Majapahit. I did put that one in because it does have some Chinese ceramics set into the gate, as many Javanese and Balinese temples once did. The valuable ones have all been ripped out and taken elsewhere. I think there's actually some Muslim saints' graves in North Java that still have original ceramics because nobody's game to steal them. But we see different remnants, including in Balinese rituals, where in this one particular ceremony you actually have people who dress in the style of ancient Javanese rulers. This is what Majapahit costume seems to have looked like, and it's been continued in Balinese ritual forms. And also the orientation, as I spoke of before, of Balinese temples towards mountains. This is a Hindu temple in Lombok, in the Balinese part of Lombok, oriented towards Gunung Rinjani in the way that we saw Candi Jawi oriented towards the mountains. Some other examples of Majapahit's style of temple architecture that's passed over, including these wonderful water gardens from Lombok. And of course, the continuation of local versions of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. Here we see two important Mahabharata scenes, the churning of the ocean on the right, and a scene of the gods of the direction, going back to that image of the Majapahit's sun that I showed right at the beginning, that shows the gods protecting the directions, here given a different form in a early 20th century Balinese painting where the gods attack Garuda and do battle with Garuda to obtain who wants to obtain the elixir of immortality from them. Now I put this one in because I'm involved in a publication that's still in process on a book on GUSTI NYOMAN LEMPAD. There is another book that's recently come out, but that's not the real book. This one that we're working on is the main publication, and LEMPAD was an example of a Balinese artist who gave quite unique depictions of the Hindu and Buddhist myths combined with local Balinese stories. In this case, this is a scene from the Adiparwa, the